Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar briefing on NARUC's recently released report, Onshore U.S. Carbon Pipeline Deployment, Siting Safety and Regulation. My name is Catherine Klein and I'm a technical advisor at NARUC Center for Partnerships and Innovation, where I support the coal modernization and carbon management partnership between the DOE and NARUC. Before we get started, I'd like to introduce today's moderator, Chair Mary Throne of the Wyoming Public Service Commission. Commissioner Throne was appointed to the commission by Governor Mark Gordon in March of 2019. She began her term as chair in March 2023. Commissioner Throne serves as the chair of the Western Interconnect Regional Advisory Body. She's a member of the Western Interstate Energy Board, and she serves as chair of the NARUC Clean Coal and Carbon Management Subcommittee. Chair Throne received a BA in history from Princeton University and a JD from Columbia Law School. Prior to joining the commission, Chair Throne represented the Wyoming Department of Environmental Quality, Air Quality Division, in the Office of the Attorney General. In private practice, Chair Throne assisted a variety of energy, mineral, and business clients with environmental compliance and permitting industrial siting and other regulatory issues. For 10 years, Commissioner Throne represented Cheyenne's House, District 11, in the Wyoming House of Representatives, serving as Minority Floor Leader for 4 years. Working in a bipartisan fashion, she played a key role in developing Wyoming's landmark carbon capture and sequestration laws. And with that, I will pass things over to Chair Throne. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine, and thank you for the kind introduction. I want to thank everybody here for joining the NARUC Subcommittee on Clean Coal and Carbon Management for today's briefing webinar on NARUC's recent report, Onshore U.S. Carbon Pipeline Deployment, Siting, Safety, and Regulation. NARUC contracted experts from public sector consultants to research and write this report. And these experts, thankfully, are here today to share a high-level overview and to answer any questions. Today's webinar is possible due to support from the U.S. Department of Energy, NARUC Coal Modernization and Carbon Management Partnership. We thank the DOE Office of Fossil Energy and Carbon Management for supporting NARUC's technical assistance activities for state regulators on coal and carbon management topics. Today, our webinar features Colin Seals, Director at Public Sector Consultants, and Carmen Siciliano, Senior Consultant at Public Sector Consultants. This webinar is being recorded, and the recording and slides will be posted on NARUC's website and emailed to attendees next week. If you have any questions, please enter those in the Q&A box, and we will get through as many as possible following the presentations. And I'd now like to introduce our panelists. Colin Seals, as a director at PSC, Colin guides strategy, research, and analysis related to local, state, and national energy policy. He helps clients identify opportunities and overcome challenges around traditional and renewable power generation, grid modernization, sustainable mining, and EV supply chains. Colin is passionate about work that helps Michigan residents and companies be full participants in the clean energy transition. Colin comes to PSC after serving as an economic affairs officer with the U.S. Department of State, where he advised ambassadors and senior U.S. officials on energy, mining, supply chains, innovation, telecommunications, and health policy. His foreign postings included Canada, Mexico, and Chile. Before working in government, Colin was a lawyer in Chicago. As a senior consultant, Carmen Siciliano brings his love for making sure things run smoothly to the energy and environment team. He conducts research and analysis, develops reports, and provides strategic counsel for the firm and its clients on issues related to local, state, and national energy policy and utility regulation. Prior to joining PSC, Carmen spent more than a decade in public service, holding numerous roles within the Michigan legislature, love state legislatures. With the Michigan Senate, he honed his research and negotiation skills, guiding several policy and appropriation proposals through the legislative process and cultivating expertise in the policy and regulatory structures related to energy and technology. And with that, I will turn it over to the panel.
Thank you, Commissioner Throne, for that introduction. We really appreciate the time and effort that NARUC and the Department of Energy in particular have spent to understand carbon capture technologies. And we really appreciate the opportunity to add to that conversation today, specifically on CO2 pipeline regulation. So I think we can start here. Carbon capture, utilization, storage, or CCUS technology has significant potential to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and mitigate the impact of climate change, particularly in hard to decarbonize industry and commercial sectors. But, and there's a but, to fully deploy CCUS technology in a way that helps the US reach its stated goal of net zero carbon emissions by 2050, Princeton University, the Great Plains Institute, other expert organizations agree we need a significant build out of pipeline to transport the captured CO2, something around a minimum of 29,000 to 66,000 pipeline miles. As of last year, we're at less than 6,000. So there are several obstacles to building out that level of infrastructure, which I'll cover briefly in a minute or two, but the focus of this paper, the paper that we produced and the webinar here, that's on the regulatory challenges facing CO2 pipeline development. So NARUC asked us to examine local, state, and federal regulations related to these pipelines to identify gaps, areas of blurred authority, as well as potential regulatory changes that might facilitate the expansion of this network in a way that keeps up with the rapid rate of incentives and investment. We hope this paper can serve as a resource for regulators and decision makers as the questions of how to cite and regulate from both a safety and an economic perspective become more salient in the years to come. So we can move to the next slide and we can talk a little bit about our scope of work. How do we go about this? Our report can be divided up into 4 sections. Quick look at CCUS and its role in the 2050 climate goals. We also looked at current CO2 transmission pipeline practices, or what we call in the paper our pipeline primer on the technology itself, the materials, safety considerations, a little bit about interconnection practices, such as they are for CO2 pipelines. We also looked at federal, state, and local responsibilities for siting safety and economic regulation. That's really the meat of the paper. That's going to be our primary focus today. And then finally, we got to some considerations or questions for regulators, the food for thought portion, the concluding portion of our paper. Let's go to the next slide. CCUS background. We're going to do this part quickly. What is CCUS? Carbon capture, utilization, and storage. It can be defined as the process of capturing CO2 from the atmosphere or sources of direct emissions, such as a power plant or industrial facility, and either reusing the CO2, say for enhanced oil recovery, or permanently storing it so that it cannot re-enter the atmosphere. Fortune Business estimated in September of last year that the CCUS global market size was worth about $2.1 billion. The global market is expected to grow at an annual rate of about 19.5% over the next 5 years and will reach around $7 billion in 2028. That growth can be attributed to increasing pressure from public and private entities to lower their GHG emissions, but what is really driving the growth right now is particularly the U.S. incentives, as far as growth in the United States. So going back a little bit, DOE, Department of Energy, has long supported CCUS projects. They've spent significant money on demonstration projects since the mid-90s. More recently, Congress has incentivized CCUS development. Since 2008, they provided the 45Q tax credit for facilities that capture and sequester CO2. And then the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, last year, it modified the credit to make it more powerful, greater incentives. It expanded the availability of the credit to increase the number of facilities that can qualify. It provided additional options for monetizing those credits, and then it extended the deadline to begin construction on eligible projects. We can move to the next slide, talk about barriers. So we're going to talk about pipeline infrastructure as the barrier, but it's important to note a few others. The first is technical feasibility around CCUS. There's a lot that's still in the R&D phase. Large-scale carbon capture systems, in particular, how scalable is this technology? I think that's still something that entities like DOE's National Energy Technology Lab are supporting more R&D on point source capture from power generation and industrial facilities specifically. That's still an obstacle. That's still something that needs to progress. Also cost. So it's considered cost effective in certain contexts, but really when it is capturing from operations that produce relatively pure CO2, But the IEA, Department of Energy, others have noted that the cost is still a major challenge for deployment and an impediment to climate goals. And I did note, the IRA provides major support for a CCUS project, but there are some who feel that more subsidies are going to be necessary. Inconsistent state level incentives. Some states, like Commissioner Throne's own Wyoming, have enacted laws to incentivize CCUS development. Others have passed similar legislation, but the majority, I would say, still haven't. And one variable, just to mention briefly, is the timeline associated with the permitting approval for the Class 6 injection wells for deep geologic storage. Only North Dakota and Wyoming have received that state primacy to take over the administration and enforcement of the program that's run out of EPA. But the idea would be that as more states acquire this primacy and this authority, that this will help those projects be approved more rapidly, because states are a little bit closer to the project. And there is funding in the bipartisan infrastructure law for states to seek primacy. Scarce opportunities for utilization. So the U, right? The U is really enhanced oil recovery, or has been historically. And as reservoirs are depleted, or as demand just goes down for fossil fuels, EOR opportunities are going to diminish. So, what other use opportunities are there? And I think you're looking at things like construction supplies, fuels, plastics, algae-based animal feed, fertilizers that are still being studied and refined, but they're not scalable. They're still at that R&D phase. So we get to scarcity of infrastructure. And as we mentioned, we have about 6,000 miles of pipelines right now. The problem, in addition to not many miles, is that they're also clustered in regions that have EOR operations, enhanced oil recovery operations. So even the network we have is limited by its concentration for parts of the country. Finally, public opposition. We'll talk about this throughout this presentation. Some don't like CCUS because they think it extends reliance on fossil fuels. That's a pretty well-known argument. Also, just citing and NIMBYism that centers around valid concerns around safety, around property rights, and then just opposition to development where people live. And then finally, environmental justice. They're advocates raising concerns about the siting of CCUS projects and infrastructure in or near disadvantaged communities, which is something that has is not unique to CCUS and to CCUS pipelines, but it's something to be aware of. So we can go to the next slide.
Right, thank you. I'd like to spend just a couple minutes covering some of the basics of CO2 transport by pipeline. Similar to hydrocarbons and other hazardous liquids, when it comes to transporting large volumes of CO2 over land, pipelines are broadly considered the most efficient, safe, and economic strategy for achieving those goals. Uniquely, depending on the pressure and temperature, CO2 can exist in 4 different states. There's a solid, which is as dry ice, liquid, gas, or as a supercritical fluid. And as a supercritical fluid, CO2 flows the most freely, and as such is really the most desirable state for pipeline transport over long distances. The pipes themselves are primarily constructed of low carbon steel with very similar characteristics to other pipeline transport and external corrosion control. Unique to CO2 is the concern for the presence of water in the CO2 stream, which can add to the corrosion of low carbon pipe or low carbon steel. And so the dehydration of CO2 when it's injected is a real key priority for the long-term transport of carbon dioxide. And as Colin noted, the small number of CO2 pipelines currently functioning raises the question of how could we take some of the 2.5+ million lines of existing hydrocarbon pipelines and convert those? Is that a possibility? And while it is technically feasible, over long distances, it is very challenging and cost prohibitive to make that conversion. We're talking about needing to add dehydrators, crack arresters, pressure control systems. All of it can be very time consuming and expensive when compared to simply building new infrastructure designed for CO2 transportation. Next slide, please. And so safety, that's something that's a recurring theme. And I think most folks on this call, if they live near a pipeline or a planned development, have probably read or seen in the news quite a bit of grassroots concern about safety of CO2 transport. And frankly, the key event that's impacting a lot of these concerns and driving the recent federal rulemaking took place just a couple of years ago. The most significant and really the only major known CO2 pipeline failure that has happened to date happened in the United States and required the evacuation of the community of Satarsha, Mississippi in February of 2020. You can see an image of the actual site of the rupture right on this slide, and the rapid depressurization resulted in the earth being blown away from the pipeline itself, and you can see the creation of dry ice, and then ultimately a gaseous CO2 plume was released that resulted in approximately 45 people needing to seek medical attention. So let's talk a little more about just what the health impacts are. They can range from very mild to severe and even death. And since CO2 is heavier than air, it has a tendency to settle in low-lying areas and confined spaces. And so the ability to anticipate the dispersion of a CO2 plume is extremely difficult and based significantly on the local geography of the site of the actual rupture. And as I mentioned, stream purity does matter. You want to mitigate the possibility for corrosion of the pipeline and make sure all the appropriate infrastructure is in place at points of injection to avoid any leaks. Next slide, please. So there have been a handful of studies. We mentioned the GPI and the Princeton study. Another approach was provided by an entity called Decarb America, who has modeled several different strategies for reaching 2050 decarbonization goals. There's actually 8 different scenarios that they modeled. And rather than taking the next step and anticipating the actual number of pipeline miles necessary to achieve those goals, that study is presented through the number of tons per year of CO2 that'll need to be transported under several different scenarios, and is interesting food for thought. The big takeaway here being that no matter what route we take to reach national decarbonization goals by mid-century, a significant CO2 pipeline network is going to be a component of that strategy. Next slide, please. So let's get into the meat of what we want to talk about today and dig into CO2, the current regulatory structure. As with any other major infrastructure development, the on-ramp to breaking ground can be pretty long and relies heavily on the approval of several public entities and the potential negotiation with private landowners. Right now, there is a significant variance across state and local boundaries for which a centralized authority is not providing project-wide oversight. The example being natural gas pipelines require a federal certificate of public convenience and necessity from FERC before moving forward. And in fact, FERC and the STB have both rejected authority over CO2 pipelines. So there isn't a single entity ensuring due diligence is happening from beginning to end on a CO2 project. That's not to say there isn't some federal involvement. Any location where a pipeline is crossing a natural resource regulated by the EPA or another agency, they may have to receive a permit for that particular portion of the pipeline. But again, it's not a holistic look from start to finish. So with a majority, this really leaves a majority of decisions to the local authorities. And we can't talk about siting without addressing some of the nuance associated with private entities gaining access to the public right of way. While most states have some form of eminent domain law, the extent to which a CO2 pipeline operator can utilize that authority is really dependent on if CO2 transport is defined as a public purpose or a public use. And some states take that a step further by requiring pipeline operators to operate as common carriers or provide access to any paying customer to use the transportation resource. As the pipelines cross multiple jurisdictions, conceivably, we could be talking about a lot of different challenges in terms of the project being completed without a unified certificate for the whole project. Let's move on to the next slide, please. And so safety, on the other hand, is one area where there's some pretty clear federal jurisdiction. PHMSA has safety oversight of interstate and some intrastate pipelines. To be clear, this doesn't mean that they have anything to do with the siting. This is once the pipelines have come online, they're observing the maintenance and operation. The exception to this rule is some states have sought and received authority to act as interstate agents and provide oversight of interstate pipelines within their borders, and others that have failed to meet minimum federal standards for intrastate pipelines result in PHMSA actually retaining responsibility for those intrastate lines. This map is a little hard to see on the slide. It is included in the paper, but it gives a pretty clear volume and responsibility demonstration for how different states are dealing with hydrocarbon and hazardous liquid pipelines. Next slide, please. So the regulatory treatment of CO2 relies on a pretty narrow definition. The current definition, which was the result of rules promulgated more than 30 years ago by PHMSA, is simply a fluid consisting of more than 90% carbon dioxide molecules compressed to a supercritical state. And an interesting nuance is that CO2 can actually change state in a pipeline as pressure fluctuations take place. It can change from a supercritical liquid to a fluid and back and forth due to minor variations. So some have raised questions that if it does not maintain that supercritical state the entirety of the pipeline, does that draw a question into PHMSA's ability to regulate it? And more recently, 2011 legislation directed PHMSA to look into setting minimum standards for CO2 transport via pipeline as a gas. In 2015, they did release a study concluding that supercritical transport was still the most likely and most prevalent practice. And to date, they have not promulgated any new rules dealing with transport as a gas via pipeline. Next slide, please. And so with the increased interest in CO2 transport and some of the other incentives that we've already talked about, PHMSA has taken some pretty significant recent action and has some ongoing plans. In response to the Satarsha incident and the findings from that investigation, last year they did release an interim advisory bulletin directing extra vigilance for pipeline operators who have a pipeline in an area that experiences extreme weather and may be susceptible to earth movement. They did release some funding to provide research on developing a dispersion modeling tool for CO2, and most significantly announced plans to initiate a new rulemaking that will deal with CO2 pipelines broadly, but also focus on emergency preparation and response standards. And coincidentally, after the completion of this paper, just the end of last month, PHMSA held a series of public meetings in Des Moines, Iowa that were very well attended and sometimes contentious, where the public expressed a lot of concerns, a lot of desire from PHMSA to take action, developing rules, ranging from a moratorium on pipelines until new rules are fully completed, to addressing very clear groundwater, agricultural damage, and long-term safe operation standards. Next slide, please. I'm sorry, I think we can go one more. I didn't lead you into that slide. I'll hand it over to Colin.
Great, thank you, Carmen. So as you might have gathered from that part of the discussion, federal regulation over CO2 pipelines is relatively narrow. Confined to safety and confined to CO2 in a particular state of matter. And so this leaves significant openings or gaps for state and local regulators to fill. And we're going to talk about that over the next few slides. But before we go through how a few states have approached this issue, I did want to set up the discussion in more general terms. A growing number of states have CO2 specific pipeline siting rules or pending legislation to that effect. When a pipeline crosses private land, many states allow developers to invoke the power of eminent domain to condemn private property. And as landowner complaints have increased around that practice, several states have considered legislation to narrow or eliminate eminent domain authority for CO2 pipeline development. And one state, California, has placed a moratorium on all CO2 pipelines until PHMSA announces the results of that current rulemaking. Unresolved safety concerns, opposition to CCUS as a climate solution, general NIMBYism around energy infrastructure really indicate that the scope of eminent domain power for CO2 pipelines is going to remain relevant for the foreseeable future. Next slide, please. So let's talk about Texas. The first CO2 pipelines in the United States were built in Texas in the early 1970s to service oil fields in West Texas and eastern New Mexico. Today, the Permian Basin remains the home to the largest network of CO2 pipelines, approximately 2,000 miles. And there are several hundred additional miles that now pass through East Texas. The Texas Railroad Commission does not require an operator to obtain a permit before building a CO2 pipeline or any pipeline. And the commission has no pipeline routing or siting authority. The pipeline operators in Texas self-designate as common carriers, as Carmen referenced earlier. Common carriers being pipelines that provide access to third parties at non-discriminatory access at uniform rates. But it's up to the courts in Texas to determine, and that would be after a lawsuit, of course, whether operators are serving as common carriers with a public purpose. Now in Texas, the public purpose that has emerged after some litigation in the standard is whether there is a quote reasonable probability that the pipeline will at some point serve at least one customer unaffiliated with the developer. That is a common carrier in Texas. And we'll put a pin in that. We'll talk about that in a bit. Next slide, please. Let's talk about Illinois. Illinois CO2 pipeline law was originally passed back in 2011 to support the coal industry and its efforts to reduce carbon emissions through clean coal facilities in the state. And that law states that transportation of CO2 by pipeline is a public use and service and in the public interest. That is in the law. But that operates more like a presumption for the lawyers on here. That's more of a legal presumption in the sense that the law also requires the Illinois Commerce Commission to conduct a comprehensive review and look into that public use question and review factors like the effects of the pipeline on the economy, on infrastructure, public safety, and interestingly, any evidence as to how the proposed pipeline will affect the security, stability, and reliability of energy. And it should be noted, although there is a public interest review in Illinois, there is no common carrier requirement, unlike Texas. So what that means is a developer transporting CO2 for private use, let's say, does not open it up to third parties, that could still meet that public interest requirement and be allowed to operate in Illinois. And Illinois does have a few items on the legislative table. There's a California-style moratorium that's being considered. They're considering stripping out eminent domain authority from the certificate of authority that they give to CO2 pipeline developers, and a few other proposals to increase oversight or limit development. And all of these bills, as of last month, are still in their early stages, but certainly something to watch. Next slide, please. Let's talk about Iowa, which is what we call the epicenter of the current CO2 pipeline debate because of the number of projects, as you can see from that graphic, that are ongoing there. The number of projects has led to a backlash, and there are significant legislative efforts to limit development, so far unsuccessful, and we talk about that in our paper, and also significant litigation. And there's a lot to cover in Iowa, but for the purposes of this presentation, I just want to highlight a lawsuit that was filed by a developer in Iowa State Court, alleging that a county ordinance, which established some setbacks and other technical requirements for hazardous materials pipelines, which cover CO2 pipelines in Iowa, they argue that was preempted by the Federal Pipeline Safety Act and also by Iowa statute. And the developer argued that the county ordinance imposed an additional permitting process that was separate and apart from standards that were already established by the Iowa Utility Board, and that effectively prohibited activity that was otherwise permitted under state law. And according to the developer, and this case is still pending, by the way, that this renders that county regulation inconsistent with state law and thus preempted, according to Iowa Supreme Court precedent. So that is an Iowa state case, but that's also something that we think bears watching if that type of argument has its way. Let's go to the next slide, please. Nebraska and Minnesota. We put them together to draw out some interesting contrasts. Neither state, so let's talk about the similarities first. Neither state has an explicit CO2 pipeline specific authority at the state level, and I'll underline explicit. The Nebraska Public Utilities Commission does not have siting authority, and it has limited authority over pipelines overall. Eminent domain authority is unclear for CO2 pipeline developers, and there have been no legal challenges yet, unlike Iowa. But something that is being seen in Nebraska is a lot of lobbying, not surprisingly, a lot of lobbying with local authorities who end up being the arbiters of whether a pipeline is going to be sited, and that's county by county. Now, move north to Minnesota. Public Utility Commission there voted unanimously, I believe it was last year or perhaps early this year, that it had the authority under existing law to regulate CO2 pipelines, even though, again, there is no explicit CO2 pipeline law currently on the books in Minnesota. But the commissioners explained I think very, very rationally, very eloquently, that this decision addresses the growing rational demand to capture carbon dioxide from ethanol plants and transport via pipeline, and quote, ensures the permitting process for CO2 pipelines will provide for an orderly review of environmental and socioeconomic impact when evaluating proposed routes. Now, interestingly, legislation was introduced this past March that would explicitly grant the commission rulemaking authority over CO2 pipelines. So we'll see where that goes. But in any event, the Minnesota Commission is exercising authority, and I believe it has a pending case before it that it is reviewing for one of the development projects up there. Next slide, please. Let's talk finally about California. I had mentioned the moratorium that's in place it's on the utilization of CO2 pipelines until PHMSA concludes its rulemaking regarding minimum safety standards. Along with that, the legislature instructed the California Natural Resource Agency and the California Public Utilities Commission to create a framework, which they did. It was released a couple of months ago for the regulation of intra-state pipelines transporting CO2. And the agencies noted something. They said tying CO2 development to a quote unclear PHMSA timeframe, which is true. You know, there is no fixed date on when that rulemaking will conclude. They said it could stall valuable projects in the state. So what it did is it recommended statutory changes to California law to allow projects to proceed once either PHMSA or California has adopted safety regulations. Now, the framework doesn't cover interstate pipelines, but the moratorium that is in place can be read. There's nothing in there that would cause you to think that it only covers intrastate. It covers all CO2 pipelines. So what's a little bit unclear is what will happen in California in terms of exercising state authority over interstate pipelines. But as California often is, it's a state to watch as this goes forward. Next slide, please.
All right, thank you. And to sum up, you know, as we talk about all these different gray areas and gaps, I just want to drive home and summarize where we are. So first, when it comes to economic regulation, I've already mentioned that both FERC and the STB have rejected any kind of economic authority. So that means users of the pipelines have to rely on their private contracts between the generator, the other users, and the actual pipeline operator. And the only clear path for dispute resolution is actually through the judicial system. When it comes to managing the physical state of CO2 as it's transported in a pipeline for safety, it's just that 90% purity supercritical standard. So that leaves a lot of question open to where and when PHMSA can engage in a large pipeline network, if they retain authority over an entire network, if any portion of it is transported as supercritical, or do they lose that authority if a portion is not? When it comes to environmental justice, you know, the Biden administration has taken a lot of important steps and directed agencies to advance and enforce equity action plans. But with the lack of a single coordinating entity or a project-wide approval, communities that are impacted don't really have a single point of access to express their concerns and negotiate with developers, and are put in a position to have to track several different regulatory processes at the state, federal, and local level, and makes access to a true siting justice very difficult for them. And finally, it's not uncommon for large infrastructure projects like pipelines to have to deal with a lot of different jurisdictions and seek a lot of approvals to complete that project. But the lack of a federal entity issuing a project-wide certificate creates a problem both for the public and for the developer themselves. You know, the public doesn't have the certainty that there is a single regulator making sure that all due diligence is done across the project, and the developer loses the security of having approval, at least on a basic legal level, to seek property across the length of the project, and can possibly upend the project or add expense as it goes through. So next slide, please.
So a brief, I guess you could call it a sidebar on international approaches to CO2 pipeline regulation. We thought it would be useful to look abroad to see if there were any lessons to be learned. And first, it should be said, the U.S. is the home of most of this infrastructure, but there are some countries that are doing some interesting things. Germany, there's a ambitious project for land-based CO2 pipeline networks in Germany that will support Germany and Europe's quest for clean hydrogen, blue hydrogen in particular. And I would recommend if folks are interested in that to read the paper for a little more detail. I'd like to focus here just briefly on Canada, our neighbor to the north. So under Canadian law, the Canada Energy Regulator, which is a federal body, exercises exclusive authority for siting, operation, and economic regulation for CO2 pipelines that cross provincial or international borders. And we could go to the next slide. And you see the picture there. That's a picture of the Souris Valley pipeline between Saskatchewan and North Dakota. That's been in operation since 2000, transporting CO2 from synthetic natural gas plant in North Dakota to Canadian oil fields for EOR. One interesting thing we pulled out from the Canada Energy Regulator is that they have instituted, because they have the same rights of way, they have eminent domain under Canadian law, they have the same rights of way concerns. So to try to resolve those conflicts in a bit more of an efficient, I guess, less contentious fashion, they have created an alternative dispute resolution process within CER that is essentially voluntary mediation with a neutral third party between landowners and developers that they claim or they report has a 98% success rate in avoiding a more formal hearing process. So, we'll talk about best practices perhaps a little bit later. That's one to note. Next slide, please. I want to say a few quick words about hydrogen and CO2. But there are some similarities that made it worthwhile to look at whether there were any learnings from hydrogen and the transportation of hydrogen. It has significant support from the bipartisan infrastructure law and the IRA. It also needs to be transported, or at least that's the ideal way to transport hydrogen by a pipeline versus overland or marine. It also lacked clear regulatory guidance at the federal and state levels. And CO2 and hydrogen are linked because blue hydrogen involves capturing CO2 during that hydrogen production process. So what do you do with the CO2 if you're making so-called blue hydrogen? But what we ended up finding is there's some key characteristics that really limit the lessons that you can learn from one to the other. I mean, for one, hydrogen is clearly an energy commodity, so it makes that public use argument easier. Under some state statutes, CO2 is classified in some states as a waste product, and so some legal experts have noted it's a tougher argument to say that transporting a waste product is of public use. Now that is probably that is changing and will change, but in any event, hydrogen doesn't face that same obstacle. Hydrogen is combustible. We all know that. There are smaller H2 molecules are smaller than CO2, so it's more prone to leakage. So the safety profile is just different. And you can expect more opposition, presumably, when it comes to siting hydrogen pipelines. And then finally, there's a little bit of, getting in the weeds, I guess, legally, but because it's transported as a gas, whereas CO2 is transported or recommended to be transported as a supercritical liquid, it makes it more likely to fall under existing federal authority, specifically FERC and its authorities under the Natural Gas Act, where it has comprehensive jurisdiction over, quote, natural or artificial gas pipelines, which you could argue is all gas. So blended hydrogen natural gas pipelines, which experts really view as the most promising and cost-effective means of transporting hydrogen through existing infrastructure, that's likely to be deemed, at the very least, an artificial gas, which would open up the door for FERC to more easily, comfortably regulate that. Whereas they have, as Carl mentioned, declined up to now to be the regulator of CO2. Next slide, please.
All right, so we'd like to wrap it up and leave you with some questions we've identified for some different stakeholders in this process. And I'll kick it off with PHMSA and Safety Authority. As we mentioned, they are about to undertake a pretty significant rulemaking venture. And from our discussions, the areas we've identified that we think they really need to focus on include, first of all, updating the definition of CO2 to make sure it's comprehensive of all forms of transport in a pipeline to ensure there's no gray area in their ability to exercise safety regulatory authority. Another component is we would encourage them to consider looking at interim direction as they develop new dispersion modeling and other tools that will support safety to encourage communities that host pipelines and pipeline operators themselves to ensure there's clear emergency response and preparation protocols. There are tools that exist like reverse 911 that can give broad notification to folks of a rupture and something that first responders in areas that could experience that need to be prepared for. And finally, it would be worthwhile to explore stream purity and maintaining a minimum standard as a lot more pipelines come online. There are many more injection points and the dangers associated with corrosion control, just to ensure there is a consistent expectation for what we're actually seeing in a pipeline when CO2 is injected. So next slide, please.
We also focused on some questions around the role of the Department of Energy, and one that we'll focus on here. How can DOE leverage its significant R&D efforts and the money associated with that, and just the general funding that they're able to deploy through various programs to encourage a collaborative approach to multi-jurisdictional development. Safety is a major concern. It's probably the major concern, and because there is still that gap where PHMSA is working on its rulemaking, but there's still a desire for emergency response guidelines and just a general understanding of how CO2 moves and disperses. One thing that the DOE could consider and is structuring those funding opportunities very clearly to prioritize selection of applications that demonstrate a commitment to safety, and specifically including route-specific strategies or requiring route-specific strategies to measure CO2 pipeline rupture impact zones and emergency communication protocols that are inclusive of each community that could be impacted. And I think this would send a signal that the DOE is prioritizing safety even in the absence of the regulations that we expect will come in the future. Next slide, please. So we'll spend a little more time on this. I mean, this was questions for public utility commissioners and state level policymakers. One question was, how can we strengthen state level authority? Clear permitting standards and regulatory authority for public utility commissioners, those are really important. They can add clarity and reduce the regulatory burden on developers who are otherwise uncertain about governing rules. It can reduce litigation at the local level. For example, in South Dakota, it allows its public utility commission to supersede zoning and local land use controls if the PUC determines that such rules or regulation or ordinances as applied to the proposed route are unreasonably restrictive in view of existing technology, factors of cost or economics or needs of the parties. Now, that's probably not feasible in every state to have something so sweeping, but it's the idea that centralizing this decision making in a knowledgeable and capable body is going to help development in that state. And in states where there's no authority on the books, legislatures, commissions, you could consider a benchmarking or some other analysis to figure out the best way forward. Another question was, how do we build up or pay for the expertise to effectively regulate CO2 pipelines at state level? We heard that when we were interviewing folks throughout this process, that there's not that same comfort and knowledge that there is with other pipelines that they're more familiar with, hydrocarbon pipelines. So one mechanism, and different states approach this in different ways, is just bolstering the chargeback provisions to ensure that commissions have the resources they need, or making those more nimble. In certain states have more robust chargeback mechanisms than others, but that's something that states can certainly look at. And then here's one that I really got into quite a bit, and there's a lot in the paper about this. I'll try not to be long-winded, but what kind of common carrier requirements can support interstate development, which is really what we're talking about, is interstate development. that common carrier requirement, the pipeline provide non-discriminatory access at uniform rates. We conclude, we think it's based on sound policy. It leads to efficient, non-duplicative networks. It's going to maximize the number of potential CO2 producers, like the emitters, customers, who would otherwise not build the infrastructure or spend the money to move their CO2. And if they're not going to move it, then they're probably not going to try to capture it unless they're able to use it on site, which some are, but many aren't. So we think common carrier requirements are good. They're a good idea if you want to build out that broad, efficient, and accessible network. But there are some issues too, and you see this because not every state has a common carrier requirement, and specifically with CO2. CO2 is historically it's a private market. It's not a public market. It's not been sold to the public. It hasn't been used as an energy resource. So the overall number of pipeline users still is pretty low. It's growing, but it's still low. But what happens is that makes it difficult for a developer to prove or to make a strong showing that it actually provides service to third parties, especially when you're talking at the permitting stage. So this is where that Texas style approach that I mentioned was interesting, because it does require pipelines to operate as common carriers, but it doesn't put too high of a burden to show it up front. And it's just this reasonable probability standard. Can they show that there's a reasonable probability that they're going to have at least one other customer? And that puts the onus on the developers to build pipelines that will draw in potential customers, without making an actual contract or something like that more, make it a requirement. And you could enhance this requirement along the lines of what CFIA has done by making tariffs a key component of the common carrier analysis to really bolster it. To make developers propose rates or even a range of rates, because these would be looking into the future, that they would plan to charge to these future customers. And then the last thing, and I said it already, so I'll just be brief here. ADR. I really think there's some potential to implement some sort of alternative dispute mechanism to avoid all of these contentious right-of-way disputes. Utah, and specifically the Department of Transportation, has reported a 75% reduction in takings-related litigation after routing disputes, after moving those disputes through the Utah Department of Commerce's Office of the Property Rights Ombudsman to mediate disputes. So that's a significant number, and you go back to what Canada reports. So this is something that states might want to consider implementing ADR procedures to reduce the time and cost of disputes around pipeline siting. Next slide, please. So we're at the end. I think there's some takeaways. Regulatory uncertainty is a threat to CCUS infrastructure deployment, pipeline deployment on the time frame and at the scale that experts believe is required. And if you think threat is too strong, I think we can agree that it will be a limitation, a drag on it. Federal agencies can lead by driving timely research, and I would add by tying funding to desirable practices that lead that further broad deployment. And then, in this conversation as part of it, there's an opening for organizations like NARUC to facilitate an inclusive CO2 policy development. So thank you. That's the end of our formal presentation, and I will throw it back to Commissioner Throne for any questions from the audience. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much, Colin and Carmen. That was incredibly informative and just certainly gave me a lot of food for thought, being from a state that is extremely interested in carbon capture, but perhaps we haven't thought a lot about the pipeline side of it. In any event, I would encourage the audience to put some questions in the Q&A. And while waiting to see if anybody has any questions, I'll just throw out one to get us started. PHMSA is still working on major revisions to its carbon pipeline rules, as you noted. Are there any interim steps that states can take to help support carbon pipeline deployment during this period?
That's a great question, Commissioner. I'll take that one. And obviously first we'd have to mention that steps range from requiring, legislation and statutory authority to things that can take place within current administrative structures. And so kind of right off the bat, the first thing I think that public utility commissions want to do is look at their existing authority. We saw that in Minnesota where they were able to determine they could take action and be more proactive on regulating CO2 pipelines. The class 6 primacy that we talked about earlier, the opportunity for PUCs to interact with the environmental regulators in their state, start building knowledge around CCUS infrastructure and what's going to go into that, and long-term planning is really important. The alternatives dispute resolution in many cases may not require a legislation to implement, and it has proven to be a successful opportunity. And the other big one that I think that could potentially be done through communication with policymakers is look at the definition of CO2. Is there a way, or how is the most strategic way to define that to achieve public benefit and assure that CO2 pipelines can actually access the tools that other pipeline operators use?
Yeah, and I would just add, states can start to study this. I think different states are at different steps in that process, but to really just begin to understand what is happening in nearby states or just elsewhere in the U.S. to see what might work in their specific context. I mean, and that's something that can be done without any regulatory or legislative authority.
Thank you. Still seeing no questions, so I'll forge ahead. So in speaking with experts for this paper, did you get a sense of any best practices for communication and public engagement strategies for carbon pipeline developers with the communities that could be impacted by the siting?
We did. I think this is not going to come as a surprise to anyone, but what we heard was that you need to be on the ground early, and you need to be working at the grassroots level. You cannot, as a developer, look at the state statute that has perhaps a broad and sweeping eminent domain power and think that that's going to be the way forward. And to the credit of those who we spoke with on the development side, I don't think that anyone is really thinking about it that way. Although I think the strength of opposition in some places has been surprising, and it has required more of a pivot in that direction of being on the ground. I mean, there's just not a lot of information about the safety profile of these pipelines, and that's a problem. And there's just a vacuum, and that vacuum is filled, I think, by a lot of fear and uncertainty, understandably so. So I think it's on the developers to help folks understand, and be in an honest and open way, what the safety risks are. And then you have to frame this in the context of an economic development opportunity. Communities need to feel like they're benefiting, whether that's directly from the infrastructure, which, the hard argument, if you're a community that is, in the middle of a 1,000-mile pipeline, or even, appealing to, someone's interest in how CCUS plays into the climate space. But, you need to meet people where they are and try to really, again, I think the takeaway is just not assuming that, well, if they don't accept our first offer, that we can just move them out. Because as we're seeing, things are becoming ensnarled in litigation. Utility commissions are responding with moratoria and other mechanisms that are creating problems for development.
Thank you. We do have a couple of questions now, so and they're sort of related, but I'll go with the first one. The uncertainty of the CO2 stream purity creates a difficult materials engineering challenge to properly specify the appropriate pipe material grade. Could you comment on that?
Carmen, you want to?
Yeah.
So,
And so admittedly, I'm not an engineer, so let me lead with that to make sure we're clear there. But that's really why we identified it as something that required further research and action by PHMSA, frankly, because if there is this inconsistency at different injection points, you're introducing that danger of damage or corrosion in different places or catastrophic failure. So on a very fundamental level, folks who have that background and are much smarter than myself need to be looking at how can we make sure that we have consistency across all the different pipelines, both the feeders and transmission pipelines nationally.
And related to that, are there sufficient technical standards for such things as steel grade, strength, weld, valves, etc.?
And so from our research, there is not, I don't want to say it's sufficient or not, it's somewhat ambiguous. So the Surface Transportation Board that regulates the interconnections for CO2 pipelines does have some very general directions saying that equipment needs to be appropriate for the use, but that's somewhat open-ended. And so it's really dependent on the different industry standards that are adopted by reference in the PHMSA rules. And so I don't want to speak to the individual characteristics of those many different PHMSA rules, but for the most part, the actual engineering standards are industry standards adopted by reference in the current rules.
And we suddenly have a lot of questions, and I'm not going to get to all of them. But going back to the public engagement question, since we have 6,000 miles approximately already of CO2 pipelines in the US that have been operating for 50 years, given that history, how can we really say there's a vacuum of safety information on CO2 pipelines?
well, I guess it depends on how where you say the vacuum is. I think that there are learnings from all of that time with CO2 pipelines that are filtering their way through the regulator that is going to ultimately decree what those standards are. But so far that hasn't happened yet. It's happening now, and so that the way that folks, it's hard to, developers can make this case in the interim because they do have that that information, but I think the vacuum comes because we still haven't heard from, I think, what folks believe is the true authority on the matter. So I don't mean to say that there's no information, only that the information is not coming through perhaps the forum and the body that will give it that authority.
And we are approaching the end of our time, but I just want to give you each, 30 seconds to answer this question. What do you want state utility regulators to take away from this report?
Sure. I think the first thing is that the issue of how to regulate the siting, construction, operation of CO2 pipelines, both from a safety and economic perspective, it's not going away. It's only going to grow. The level of incentives, the level of potential economic benefit is just too high, and we're already seeing that these projects are racing out ahead of the regulatory regimes that are intended to govern them. PHMSA might not be walking through that door anytime soon, right? I mean, we don't know exactly when those standards are going to come through, and even when they do, they'll only be with regard to the safe operations of the line. So, we want state regulators to talk to each other, and that happens through organizations like NARUC. But these projects are multi-jurisdictional, and as long as there's this patchwork, we're I think going to feel a drag on the development of the pipelines that many feel are necessary. So I think if you're from a very high level, it's about acknowledging that this issue is here to stay, really grappling with it, trying to understand it, and doing that in part by communicating with their fellow regulators in other states.
Thank you so much, Colin, for that answer. And I think with that, I better wrap up. We're a little behind. Thank you so much, Colin and Carmen, for your time. And thank you to the DOE Office of Fossil Energy and Carbon Management for supporting this webinar. Thank you to the audience too for joining us. I would also like to thank commissioners, commission staff, federal government staff, and various subject matter experts who provided comments on earlier drafts of the report. Registration is open for the NARUC annual meeting in August, or annual summer meeting in Austin, Texas from July 16th to the 19th. You can visit the NARUC site to register. And please note that the subcommittee on clean coal and carbon management will have a panel on Sunday from 2:45 to 3:45 Central Time at the NARUC Summer Policy Summit. The panel will be on balancing new EPA power plant emission rules with reliability considerations. We will be sharing the presentations from this webinar via email with the attendees, and the recording will be uploaded to NARUC's YouTube channel. Check NARUC's website for information on other upcoming activities, and please reach out to Kira and Catherine at NARUC with any questions or feedback. And I would also like to thank our NARUC staff, Kira Zeidelman and Catherine Klein, for their work on this webinar. And thank you again for joining us, and have a great day.